Who the fuck is that? The whisper sliced through the pre-dawn chill of the barracks, sharp and serrated. It was October 29th, 1945. Outside, a bitter wind howled down from the Scottish Highlands, rattling the thin wooden walls of the repurposed stable that was now their cage. Inside, at Camp 117, Blackwood Manor, 28 women held their breath. The sound came again. Not the brutal kick of a combat boot they'd been conditioned to expect, not the metallic scrape of a rifle butt against wood. This was something else, a firm, deliberate knocking. Thump. 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 Civilized, almost polite, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. They knew what happened to captured women. The stories had been hammered into their minds since they were girls in the Bund Deutscher Mädel, whispered warnings from mothers and lurid tales from the front. They'd seen it in the dying days of the Reich. Women dragged from cellars in Dresden. Nurses pulled screaming from field hospitals as the Eastern Front imploded. Propaganda had assured them the British were no different, perhaps worse for the veneer of civility that masked their barbarism. Helene Schmidt, who'd only turned 18 in the suffocating darkness of a Berlin communications bunker, began to tremble uncontrollably. She pressed herself into the corner, the rough-hewn planks digging into her back, her mind a frantic, blank slate where prayers used to be. Anneliese Vogel, a 32-year-old surgical nurse who'd seen enough horror to last 1,000 lifetimes, instinctively reached for Helene's hand. Her own was ice-cold. "Inspection," someone hissed in the dark, the word thick with dread. "They're going to make us strip." "We won't," another voice shot back, low and defiant. It was Elsbeth Richter, a 23-year-old cipher clerk whose sharp intelligence was now coiled into a knot of pure fear. "We will not take our clothes off for them." The bolt on the outside of the door scraped back with a deafening finality. The door swung inward. If this part of history is new to you, you are far from alone. This is a story that was intentionally buried, a footnote deemed too complicated for the grand, simple narrative of good versus evil. Hit that subscribe button, because we unearth the stories the victors tried to forget. Framed in the doorway were 3 figures, black silhouettes against the bruised purple of the Scottish dawn. They were British guards, their khaki uniforms impossibly clean, their posture relaxed. The scent of coal smoke, damp wool, and something shockingly mundane, soap, drifted into the stale air of the barracks. One of them, a man whose weary face was etched with lines that spoke of more than just his middle age, held a clipboard. Another, a boy barely older than Helene, stared at a point on the ceiling, his jaw tight, as if he couldn't bear to meet their eyes. The third guard carried a large object wrapped in brown paper. The man with the clipboard cleared his throat. He spoke in slow, careful German, the accent thick, but the words clear. "Good morning," he said. "We have brought you breakfast." Silence. A profound, uncomprehending silence that swallowed the sound of the wind. The women stared, their minds refusing to process the word. Breakfast. Not line up, not strip, not the guttural commands for a humiliating inspection they had steeled themselves for. Just breakfast. The guard with the package stepped forward, his movements deliberate and slow, as if approaching a herd of spooked deer. He placed the parcel on the crude trestle table in the center of the room. As his fingers unfolded the paper, a scent filled the barracks that was so powerful, so evocative, it felt like a physical blow. Bread. Not the sawdust-laced gray brick of German rationing, but real, honest-to-God bread, its crust a deep, burnished gold, still radiating a faint warmth. Next to the loaf, he set down a tin of margarine, a jar of marmalade, And then, impossibly, a glass bottle filled with fresh white milk. The sight was so alien, so decadent, it felt like a hallucination. "The lorry with hot water for washing will be here in an hour," the older guard announced, his eyes flicking from his clipboard to the stunned faces before him. "You'll need to register your names and former units for the official records, but there is no rush. Eat first." They turned and left. The door clicked shut behind them. It didn't lock. For a full minute, the only sound was the frantic beating of 28 hearts. Then, little Helene, the girl from the Berlin bunker, slid down the wall and began to weep, deep, ragged sobs of confusion and relief that finally broke the spell. These women had never imagined a future as prisoners of war. They were the invisible cogs in the vast machine of the Wehrmacht. Nachrichtenhelferinnen, female communications auxiliaries, recruited from the Reich Labor Service to fill the ever-expanding administrative needs of a war that spanned a continent. They were radio operators, teletypists, and cipher clerks. There were nurses, too, and secretaries assigned to Luftwaffe field commands. They had worn the gray-blue uniform, the eagle and swastika stitched on the sleeve. They had been taught to march, to salute, to believe they were performing a vital patriotic duty, the unseen sinew that held the glorious German war machine together. And then, in the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich disintegrated into a Götterdämmerung of fire and blood, their world had simply vanished. Elsbeth Richter had been stationed in Denmark, in a concrete bunker on the coast, transcribing encrypted signals about U-boat patrols that no longer existed and Luftwaffe squadrons that had no fuel to fly. Her war ended on May 5th, when a fresh-faced British officer, looking exhausted and profoundly sad, had walked into her radio room and politely asked her and the other women to step away from their equipment. There was no battle, no final stand, just the quiet, bewildering fizzle of static as a 1,000-year empire died on the airwaves. Anneliese Vogel's war had ended in a field hospital near the Ardennes, a charnel house of mud and gangrene. She'd spent the final months holding down screaming boys while a surgeon sawed through shattered limbs, her own hands permanently stained with the blood of children sent to die for a lost cause. When the American tanks finally rolled past, she had simply walked out into the courtyard, her apron stiff with gore, and waited for whatever came next. She felt nothing but a vast, hollowed-out exhaustion. And Helene Schmidt had spent her 18th birthday deep beneath the streets of Berlin, typing frantic dispatches for phantom armies while the world above was being pounded into dust by Russian artillery. On May 2nd, a superior officer had told them it was every man for himself. She'd joined a desperate exodus of civilians fleeing west, walking for 3 weeks on shoes that fell apart, eating weeds and tree bark, until she'd stumbled, skeletal and delirious, into a British checkpoint near the Elbe. A soldier had given her a piece of chocolate. It was the first act of human kindness she'd experienced in months, and she'd been too shocked to even thank him. By the late summer of 1945, thousands of these German female auxiliaries had been rounded up across the British occupation zone. Most were quickly processed and released back into the ruins of their homeland. But a few hundred, those like Elsbeth with knowledge of codes, or those like Anneliese who'd served in sensitive command areas, were deemed to have potential intelligence value. They were slated for transport to Britain for further interrogation. The journey across the North Sea was a descent into hell. They were herded onto a transport ship in Cuxhaven on a morning thick with fog and the stench of decay. Rumors flew through their ranks like a contagion. Were they being sent to labor camps in Canada? To America? Or was this a ruse, a convenient way to dispose of them in the cold, gray waters of the North Sea? They were forced below deck into a cavernous cargo hold that reeked of diesel and cordite. 200 women crammed into a dark, airless space designed for ammunition crates. As the ship began to roll on the heavy seas, the heat and stench became unbearable. Panic began to set in, a low hum of terror that grew with every lurch of the vessel. "I was certain we would die down there," Elspeth would later write in a secret diary. "I decided it was better to suffocate in the dark than to drown in the sea. I don't know why that distinction seemed so important then." After 36 hours that felt like an eternity, the rhythm of the ship's engines changed. They heard the cry of gulls, the first sign of life beyond their floating prison. Then, voices shouting in English, a heavy hatch was thrown open, and a rectangle of blinding gray light fell upon them. "Up, everyone up, single file!" They stumbled up a steep ladder and onto the deck, blinking in the unfamiliar light of a Scottish afternoon. The port, which they would later learn was Leith, was a panorama of shocking, overwhelming abundance. Cranes moved with purpose, unloading mountains of supplies from waiting ships. Trucks, painted in military green, were lined up for miles, laden with crates of food, lumber, and machinery. And beyond the industrial chaos of the docks, they could see hills that were impossibly, vibrantly green. Germany was a monochromatic landscape of rubble and ash. Here, even the air seemed to have color. They were put on a train, not a cattle car, but a passenger train with upholstered seats. They were handed sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, white bread, a slice of ham, a sliver of cheese. Helene ate hers in 3 frantic bites, and then burst into tears, hiding her face in her hands, ashamed of her own desperate hunger. The train rattled north, through a countryside that seemed to have been entirely untouched by war. They saw villages with intact roofs, churches with unbroken spires, children playing in green fields. There was no rubble, no bomb craters, no skeletal remains of burned-out buildings. Anneliese pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window, a bitter, complex emotion churning in her gut. It wasn't just anger or grief or envy. It was a profound sense of dislocation, as if she had passed through a veil into another reality. "They didn't suffer," she whispered to herself, the thought feeling like a betrayal. "Not like we did." She was wrong, of course. Britain had bled. The Blitz, the U-boat blockade, the years of rationing, the scars were there, just less visible than the pulverized cities of Germany. The fundamental difference was that Britain had bent, but it had not broken. Its social fabric, its infrastructure, its very sense of self had survived. Germany's had been annihilated. They arrived at Blackwood Manor near Inverness as a cold dusk settled over the Highlands. The estate had once belonged to some minor aristocrat before being requisitioned for the war. Now it was encircled with barbed wire and dotted with guard towers. But it also had amenities that felt like unimaginable luxuries: running water, electricity, and a kitchen that produced hot food. That first night they huddled together on their crude bunks, wrapped in thin blankets, speaking in hushed whispers, waiting for the reality of their situation to crash down upon them. They were prisoners. The enemy. And they knew what the enemy deserved. But the moment that truly began to dismantle their entire worldview, the moment that planted the seed of a terrifying, liberating doubt, was that breakfast. The smell of warm bread. The quiet, unthreatening voice of the guard who had told them to eat first. It was in this small, simple act of decency that the lies they had been fed for a decade began to crumble. And this is where their real war, the war for their own minds, truly began. Stay with us. And if you're finding value in this forgotten history, take a moment to hit the like button. It helps these stories reach more people. It wasn't just the breakfast. It was everything that followed. That first afternoon, a woman from the British Red Cross arrived. She was middle-aged with a face full of weary compassion. Speaking through a translator, she explained that they would each be offered a medical examination. "It is entirely voluntary," she stressed, looking each of them in the eye. "You may refuse, but after the conditions of your journey, it is highly recommended." A wave of fear rippled through the room. A medical examination. They knew the euphemisms. They had been drilled into them. This was it. Anneliese Vogel stood up. As the most experienced nurse, she felt a duty to go first. "I will go," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear clawing at her insides. If it was going to be horrific, she would face it and find a way to warn the others. The examination room was a small, clean office in the main house. A female doctor, also British, with graying hair and tired, intelligent eyes, gestured for Anneliese to sit on a chair. There was no stark examination table, no ominous instruments laid out. The doctor took her pulse, listened to her breathing with a stethoscope, and looked down her throat. She noted the clear signs of malnutrition and dehydration and the beginnings of a chest infection. She prescribed a course of penicillin, the new miracle drug they'd only heard about in hushed, reverent tones, along with extra rations and 2 days of bed rest. "Is that all?" Anneliese asked the translator, her mind reeling. "That is all," the doctor confirmed through the interpreter. "Unless there is anything else you wish to discuss?" Anneliese walked back to the barracks in a daze, her legs unsteady. "She examined me," she told the anxious women waiting for her. "Like a real doctor, that was all." In the days that followed, this pattern of baffling decency continued. Meals arrived 3 times a day. They were simple but filling. Porridge and tea in the morning, a thick vegetable soup, and more of that miraculous bread for lunch, and a meat or fish stew for dinner. No one shouted at them. No one struck them. No one leered at them. The guards kept a professional, almost detached distance. They were captors, not tormentors. Helene, the youngest, found herself breaking down at the strangest moments. The warmth of a cup of tea in her cold hands. The rough but clean texture of a wool blanket. The profound, uninterrupted silence of a night spent sleeping without fear. "I don't understand," she whispered to Elsbeth one evening, as they sat by the small iron stove that warmed the barracks. "Why are they being kind to us?" Elsbeth, who had spent years of her life learning to decipher hidden meanings and read between the lines of official communiques, thought for a long moment. "Maybe," she said slowly, the idea forming as she spoke. "It is because they won. They have nothing left to prove." But even that didn't fully explain the small, personal gestures that kept chipping away at their defenses. One day, Elsbeth was called to the commandant's office. She went, her heart pounding, expecting an interrogation. Instead, an administrator handed her a small package. It wasn't from home. Mail from the ruins of Germany was virtually non-existent. It was from the camp. Inside, she found a thick, hand-knitted wool cardigan. It was clearly second-hand, but clean, and in good condition. Tucked into the pocket was a small, neatly printed card. It read, "From the Women's Voluntary Service. We hope this keeps you warm." Then there was the afternoon when Helene casually mentioned to another prisoner that it was her 18th birthday. She expected nothing. The date was just another number in a life that had been stripped of all meaning. But that evening, the camp cook, a stern-faced Scottish woman named Mrs. Baird, whose own 2 sons had been killed fighting the Germans in North Africa, appeared at the barracks door. She was carrying a small, lopsided cake. It was a simple thing, made with a bare scraping of jam and wartime rations, but she had used her own sugar allowance to make it. "A young lass deserves a bit of cake for her 18th, she said gruffly, not meeting Helene's eyes. Helene burst into tears so violent and overwhelming that she couldn't speak, let alone eat, for 10 minutes. The young guard, the one who had so assiduously avoided their gaze on that first morning, turned out to be a Welsh farm boy named Corporal Davies. He was 21 and had landed on Juno Beach on D-Day. He had seen things in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of Germany that he would never speak of. During the evenings, he began to unofficially teach them a few English phrases. "Might come in useful," was all he would say. He treated them not as Nazi women, but as people. He would sometimes show them a worn photograph of his family's farm in Wales. "That's my mam," he'd say, pointing. "And that's our sheepdog, Bess. Daft as a brush, but a good girl." Annalise, who had forced herself to see the dying German soldiers in her care as boys rather than military units, found herself doing the same with Corporal Davies. He was just a boy in a uniform, homesick and weary of war, just like the ones whose hands she had held as they bled out on her cots. The cognitive dissonance was a physical weight in her chest. Everything she had been taught, everything she had been ordered to believe, was a lie. The British were not the monsters of Goebbels' propaganda films. They were just people. One evening in late November, someone suggested they sing. The idea felt illicit, dangerous. To raise their voices together in German songs, would that be seen as an act of sedition? But they did it anyway. They started quietly with a folk song. Then, with more confidence, they began to sing Brahms's lullaby, Guten Abend, Gute Nacht, a melody every German child knew by heart. Halfway through the second verse, Annalise saw Corporal Davies standing in the open doorway, listening. She instinctively tensed, expecting a sharp order to be silent. Instead, he just stood there, a strange, sad smile on his face. When the song finished, he spoke softly. "My grandmother used to sing that to me," he said. "Different words, of course, Welsh words, but the same tune. Funny, isn't it?" Later that night, one of the older women, a former schoolteacher, finally broke down. "How are we supposed to reconcile this?" she cried, gesturing around the relative comfort of their barracks. "Everything we were told, everything we believed about them. How do we make it fit with this?" It was Elsbeth who answered, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe we don't," she said. "Maybe we just have to accept that we were lied to about everything." But to accept that was to accept so much more. That the glorious war they had supported was a monstrous crime. That the ideology that had defined their world was a poisonous cult of death. That the 1,000-year Reich they had been promised had been nothing but a gangster's fantasy. It was easier, safer, to cling to the belief that this kindness was a trick, a sophisticated form of psychological torture designed to break them before the real cruelty began. But the weeks turned into a month, then 2, and the cruelty never came. November 28th, 1945. A letter from Mutti arrived today, smuggled through the Red Cross. "Our apartment building in Hamburg is gone. She is living in a cellar with 6 other families. She writes of the cold, the hunger. She asks if the British are treating me well. How can I possibly answer her? How can I write that I eat 3 hot meals a day while she starves? That I have a wool blanket and a warm stove while she shivers in a ruin? That our sworn enemies have shown me more humanity than our own leaders ever did? The guilt is a stone in my stomach. I feel it with every bite of bread. But I eat it. I eat every last crumb." From the diary of Elsbeth Richter, discovered in 2002. The winter deepened, and with it, their understanding. They learned about the British rationing system, that it was strict, but meticulously fair. Every person in the country, from a duke to a dustman, had a ration book. The guards in the camp ate the exact same food the prisoners did. Baird, the cook, had indeed given up her entire family's sugar ration for a month to make Helene's birthday cake. "Someone did the same for my boy when he was in a hospital in Italy," she explained gruffly when Annalise tried to thank her. "Just passing it on." In December, the camp staff organized a small Christmas celebration. They decorated the common room with pine branches and handmade paper chains. They sang carols, a clumsy but heartfelt mix of German and English. An American aid package had arrived, and the camp commandant distributed the contents: tins of fruit, soap, and a handful of Hershey's chocolate bars among the prisoners. Annalise held her chocolate bar for a full day before she could bring herself to unwrap it. The taste was so intensely sweet, so redolent of a forgotten world of peace and plenty, that it brought tears to her eyes. "We were supposed to hate them," the schoolteacher said that night, her voice full of wonder. "They made it so easy for us to hate them. And now," Elsbeth finished for her, "they are making it impossible." The truth was now undeniable, a massive, unmovable object in the center of their lives. They had been wrong. Not just wrong about the British, but wrong about the very nature of their world. The ideology that had promised them racial purity and national greatness had delivered only rubble and mass graves. The propaganda that had screamed of enemy atrocities had simply been a mirror, reflecting Germany's own monstrous actions back as an accusation. The leaders who had demanded their absolute loyalty were now dead by their own hands, or cowering in prison cells awaiting trial, leaving millions to sift through the wreckage of their lies. Repatriation began in the spring of 1946. They were processed in small groups, given new identity papers, a pittance of money, and tickets for the long journey back to the shattered continent. A strange fear gripped many of them. They did not want to go back. Britain, with its rationing and its gray skies, felt safer and more sane than the chaotic, starving wasteland that had once been their home. Annalise returned to a Hamburg so utterly destroyed that she could not recognize her own street. She found her sister trading cigarettes on the black market and moved into a corner of her cellar. Her sister did not want to hear stories about the kindness of the British. Elsbeth went back to her hometown in Schleswig-Holstein to find her family home occupied by desperate refugees who had fled the advance of the Red Army. She didn't have the heart to make them leave. With her language skills, she found a job as a translator for the British occupation authorities. Her former neighbors spat the word collaborator at her behind her back. Helene, having lost her entire family, had no home to return to at all. She became one of the millions of displaced persons, drifting through the occupied zones, haunted by the ghosts of Berlin and the baffling memory of a Scottish cook's kindness. But they wrote to each other. Over the years, they painstakingly reconnected, forming a small, private network of women bound by an experience no one else could understand. In 1955, Annalise organized a reunion in a small cafe in Hanover. 10 of them came. "Do you ever think about Corporal Davies?" Helene asked, now a grown woman with sad eyes. "I wonder if he ever got back to his farm." "I think about Mrs. Baird's cake," someone else said. "All the time." They had all carried these small moments of grace away from Scotland, embers of humanity that had burned through the edifice of their indoctrination. For some, it became the foundation of a new life, a commitment to reconciliation and peace. For others, the psychological conflict was too great, and they buried the memories, unable to reconcile them with their enduring, complicated love for the country that had betrayed them. But none of them ever forgot. In 1972, a British historian researching POW camps stumbled upon the records of Camp 117. He tracked down and interviewed several of the women, including Elsbeth. His subsequent article, titled "The Unlikely Re-Education at Blackwood Manor," caused a minor stir. German nationalists accused the women of being traitors who were flattering their captors. But others saw the story for what it was. Elsbeth, then a grandmother living a quiet life in Kiel, wrote a letter to the editor of the newspaper that published the article. It was printed in full. "I do not claim that our time as prisoners was pleasant," she wrote. "We were captives, far from home, frightened and uncertain. But we were not abused. We were not starved. We were not violated. We were treated like human beings by men and women who had every reason to hate us. This decency was a profound shock, because our government had spent 12 years telling us it was impossible. That shock changed us. It forced us to ask questions we had been too afraid to even think. Germany had to confront the monumental lies it had built its identity upon. And we, in that small camp, had to confront our own. The British were not trying to re-educate us. They were simply behaving with a basic humanity. That this seemed revolutionary to us says everything you need to know about what our country, and we ourselves, had become." The knock came at dawn. They braced for brutality and were met with bread. This is just one of thousands of such stories, stories that complicate our easy narratives of war. Where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments below, and join a global community dedicated to remembering the past in all its difficult complexity. History remembers the grand strategies, the turning points, the names of generals and the dates of great battles. But history is also forged in these small, quiet moments. In the choice of a guard to offer food instead of a fist. In the compassion of a cook who shares her meager rations. In the smile of a young soldier who shows you a picture of his dog. These acts do not change the outcome of a war, but they can, in time, change the world. They are the slow, patient work of rebuilding a shared humanity from the ashes of hatred. Some of the women of Camp 117 became vocal advocates for peace. Others lived out their lives in silence. A few could never let go of the Germany they had been taught to love, even while acknowledging the nightmare it had unleashed. But every one of them was forever marked by that autumn morning in 1945. The moment when terror was met with kindness. The moment the door opened not to a monster, but to a man with a loaf of bread. What happened at Blackwood Manor was not an anomaly. It was the quiet application of a principle, the Geneva Conventions, a radical idea that even in the midst of total war, your enemy remains a human being. Each time that principle was upheld, a seed was planted. A seed of doubt in the mind of a prisoner. A seed of understanding that would, for some, blossom decades later. Germany's long and painful post-war reckoning did not begin at the Nuremberg trials. It began in moments just like this, in the dizzying cognitive dissonance of a generation that had been promised glory and inherited only shame, and who were shown the first tentative path back to humanity not by their own leaders, but by their enemies. The British guards who delivered that breakfast probably forgot the incident by lunchtime. It was just another task in a long and weary occupation. But for the 28 women inside that barracks, it was the beginning of the end of one life and the start of a difficult, uncertain new one. The journey back from the darkness of ideology is a long one. For them, it began with a single, simple, revolutionary act, a knock on the door that brought not violation, but breakfast. And in that moment, buried deep in the footnotes of a terrible war, everything began to change.